there have been many concerns with the World Bank's use of economic conditionalities. So what's the Dutch position on that issue?
Well, I think in general there is a lack of accountability of the World Bank and also of the IMF to the people concerned. The accountability is towards the governors, towards me, but much less to the people concerned in the countries themselves. Let me give you an example. If there is a borrowing agreement between, I don't know, India and the World Bank, normally the Parliament of India is not concerned, leave alone the local parliaments in the different states of India, leave alone the many people who are directly concerned, for instance, by a privatisation policy. Second, I think overall the conditionality of the international financial institutions should be really limited to the key areas that are necessary to ensure that in a specific period of time the loan can be repaid. That's the sensible conditionality. The not sensible conditionality is the conditionality that deals with ideology or with putting issues on the table that are not directly related to this. I think the key is that the World Bank and the IMF, and we have a chance to discuss that now in Washington, especially in the World Bank, because after the very dismal period during which President Wolfowitz was leading the bank, of course now it is necessary to look at the strategic role of the bank, and conditionality, privatization, pro-poor growth will be the key areas to be discussed.
So you think that there is a chance to have some work on economic conditionality so that economic conditionalities could be erased from World Bank policy lending?
Well, I think the economic conditionality, the word, I don't like the word conditionality. Normally it is when you have a lending or borrowing agreement, you put certain conditions, which is fair. You want to make sure that the money is actually going towards the poor according to, I don't know, the poverty reduction strategy papers or towards what has been discussed with the people locally. That's fair conditionality because that's a contract between two parties, not a one-sided contract. There is a more difficult area, which I think is the relationship between the IMF and the World Bank. And I think one of our main issues of the Dutch government will be to ensure that also the IMF, when looking to its conditionality, especially to the poorest countries, when necessary, because sometimes you think, is the IMF necessary in the poorest countries? But when it would be necessary for any support for the balance of payment deficits, that in that case one looks at the poverty strategies, the growth strategies, so that it's possible for the poorest countries to grow out of the sometimes very difficult situations in which they are.
So what's the position considering for World Bank support for fossil fuel project, considering on one side the climate change impact of that, and on the other side that this funding actually benefits quite substantially large-scale corporations rather than developing countries themselves?
Well, I think when you travel throughout Africa, I just came back from Uganda, you see that there are enormous energy needs. I look to a country like Uganda, 5% of the people are linked to any form, if you could say, modern energy. So that energy investment is necessary, for me, is key. But there are many alternatives. And if I look to, for instance, Uganda, there's an enormous possibility to work in sustainable ways of promoting energy. And I think the first and foremost task of the World Bank is to look to clean and alternative energy. It doesn't exclude, I think, any form from other energy. But that can only be the case, as the report that you referred to was mentioning, if it is seriously discussed with the people concerned, and if it can be made and done in such a way that it is sustainable. I would not say that we forbid developing countries more than we do our own nations. It should be about the equal distribution of the very limited space that we have environmentally, and therefore I think the concerns are much more in the richer world, because they are basically leading to the situation that in many African countries, but also in the countries in Southern Asia, there is an enormous risk of climate change, of poverty, of scarcity, and therefore of conflict. But there are two essential elements when you talk about large-scale programs. First of all, that they are democratically chosen by the local parliaments, to the extent that there is a good parliament, obviously. Good governance is a political term. That there is a good way of ensuring that it is not a corrupt project. Thirdly, I think it has to be based on proper contracts. I'm just referring to the Congo, where we had these enormous problems, for instance, not so much for energy but for forestry. And I just came back from the Congo, and we discussed exactly this issue with the World Bank and the Congolese government. And fourthly, of course, that the local population is directly concerned. You cannot have a big program in the Congo when the pygmies are not concerned, are able to decide on their own future. So this is the key, I think. It's a combination of choice, anti-corruption, accountability and participation. And that is the way we look at it.
How much the decision of decision makers and governments are influenced by the stories from the ground and by events like the public hearing that we're going to organize on Monday?
Look, I think the movement for a more globalisation with a human face, so to speak, the reform of the international financial institutions is enormously influenced by meetings that you are organizing today. I've been myself in those movements in the 80s and in the 90s. And if you look, of course we are not satisfied yet, but if you look to the changes even in the World Bank made in the 90s, it is quite substantial compared to the period before that. You might not find it enough, so you have to struggle for the next phase. And that is where we are having a lot of room for maneuver now, because in the period from now October, when we have the Development Committee, to next April, when there is a new meeting, there is an enormous amount of discussion about a new strategic role for the World Bank. And I'm planning also in the Netherlands to organize a big conference, including with non-governmental organizations, what we think that new role for the World Bank should be. Poorer countries should be better represented. The international public goods like climate change, poverty and conflict should be linked and led to good country programs, which I think is insufficiently the case. The representation of the bank is still too much in Washington and not enough in developing countries. And a lot of the consultation is improving, but is often done in a way that it is not structural and that people can be sidelined. That's a big program, and I think we can work on it in the next 6 or 7 months.